you can't possibly decide you want to spend the rest of your life with someone after knowing them for 3 months. You have seen
Yeah.
them in like 10 out of 10 million different types of situations that you will
hmm
encounter in your entire life.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life. This week, we had Dr. Sarah Schewitz on the show, and we had a great conversation about pathological love relationships, cognitive dissonance, and how to recognize that you may be in a pathological love relationship and how to leave and avoid another abusive relationship. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, we have Dr. Sarah Schewitz joining us. Dr. Sarah is a licensed psychologist specializing in love and relationships. She is the founder of the incredibly successful online psychology practice Couples Learn. Today, Sarah and I will be discussing what coercive control is, what a pathological love relationship is, and how the two are related, if at all. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sarah.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you. We are excited to really delve into these difficult topics, but so important. And so I am very much looking forward to our conversation.
Me too.
And so, Sarah, for our listeners, would you please share a little bit about your journey to how you got to where you are now professionally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have been providing therapy to individuals and couples for over 15 years now. I started my practice Couples Learn about 7 years ago, I'd say. And as I've progressed working with couples and individuals, I've really seen how much attachment trauma and our attachment experiences in childhood play such a big part in who we choose as partners and how we show up as partners. So I've really made that my mission with the company to help heal generational trauma that gets passed down through family members over and over again to have healthier relationships.
Wow. Well, that is fascinating, of course, and so great. I love it, when professionals are really focused on a certain types of clients and able to help them, because I think then you can just go really so much more deeper into that specialty and really make a difference for them, I'm sure.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, for our listeners who may not know, would you mind describing the difference between a licensed psychologist versus a therapist?
Yeah, the terms are somewhat interchangeable. I call myself a therapist much of the time, but education-wise, there's a bit of a difference. To use the term psychologist, you have to have a PhD or a PsyD, and you need to be licensed by the state, whatever state you're practicing in. Um, Therapists are also licensed, but they usually have a master's, or some do have a doctorate, but they are they are licensed at the master's level.
Got it. Okay. And we we're talking today about pathological love relationships, which that's a lot in and of itself. So we got to start with that, right? Could you please define for our listeners like what that type of relationship is?
Yeah. I mean, it's what most people would call a toxic relationship. There's a lot of push and pull. It causes trauma. There's a lot of fighting, usually manipulation, gaslighting, like all those kind of buzzwords that we're hearing a lot
Mhm.
of today. This is the more technical psychological term for a toxic relationship, essentially.
Okay. And how do you know? Like, what are some of the identifiers? Because I'm sure many of our listeners are like, gosh, I wonder, is that what that is that I have? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, so there's an association that studies these relationships and also studies the factors that go into like what is a pathological love relationship. So it's an association of survivor research and treatment. And they've identified these four factors. So the first is that one person in the relationship, and it could be both, has a cluster B personality disorder. So that could be antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, or narcissistic personality disorder. NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, is definitely the one we hear the most about when we hear about
Mm-hmm.
these relationships. So that's the first thing, is somebody has to have that diagnosis. Now, they haven't always necessarily been diagnosed because they don't always seek help, but they likely would be if they had sought help.
Mm-hmm.
The second is that the relationship has really dramatic and erratic tendencies. The third is that the survivor or the victim in this circumstance has these specific super traits that make them susceptible as a victim. And the fourth is that the survivor has trauma symptoms. So that's how you know it's a pathological love relationship and not just a bad relationship.
Got it. Okay. Okay. I appreciate that distinction, because it's important, right? 'Cause sometimes it's just a bad relationship. So let's break that down a little bit. How would you define dramatic and erratic behaviors?
So the cluster B personality disorders that I mentioned earlier are, their other name is dramatic and erratic personality disorders. So it's honestly just what it sounds like. They're
Okay.
the folks who have these personality disorders often have unstable lifestyles. They're characterized by lots of defensiveness, lots of unhealthy coping strategies like projecting their shame and blame onto others. Their interpersonal relationships are usually a mess, lots of up and down and dysfunction. They can't really regulate their emotions very well. They may see themselves as this really like unique and special and grandiose person that's kind of exempt from rules or exempt from like normal behavior. They can be pretty antagonistic towards others,
Mhm.
often lack insight about their own harmful behavior. Boundaries aren't really their strong suit. They often derive satisfaction from power and control over others, not from having a good relationship or leading a good life with good values. It's more like, how do I exert control and power over others?
And that does make sense because you talked about the histrionics and then of course the narcissistic or sociopath. Those are all sound very dramatic and definitely erratic
Yeah. Hmm.
in their title, like you said. Now you also talked about the special super traits that make you susceptible. I'm very interested to know what those are.
I feel like a lot of the listeners are going to feel very seen and maybe called out when I share these. So I'm just
Okay,
saying that
good.
ahead of time.
Uh-huh.
Um, and this is a big one to unpack. So we can, interrupt me if you want to have more of a conversation about any of them.
Right.
Um, but what the research has found is that people who are more susceptible to getting into these relationships have certain personality traits that make them susceptible. And historically, we thought people who get in relationships with cluster B personality disorders tend to be like codependent or kind of helpless or um, not very confident.
Mhm.
And like people who get into domestic violence relationships, that's often the prototype that we see. It's
Mhm.
not the case with these relationships. A lot of
Okay.
times, these are really um, confident, strong, successful women, and that's one of the factors, is that they are self-directed. So that's a personality trait
Ooh.
that showed up in the research. So they have high levels of confidence and high levels of self-acceptance. They're used to handling things well and feeling strong. And this elevated trait of self-acceptance seems to be one of the traits that sometimes narcissists and antisocial psychopaths actually go after because they derive joy in taking down a strong woman and see it as a challenge.
Wow.
Then the damaged self-concept that they get from being in a relationship with a person like this and being completely confused and gaslit causes this cognitive dissonance, which is
Mhm.
this experience where, and I say woman, a lot of times women are the victims in this circumstance, but certainly not always. But like these women go from feeling like I'm so strong and I'm so confident, and that's how I've always known myself, to I am like falling apart. I don't know what's real. I can't think clearly. And this cognitive dissonance is actually like one of the biggest factors that causes problems for people in these relationships is how they see themselves versus how they used to see themselves. And then also how they used to see their partner when they were in this like love bombing phase that we'll get into later in
Mhm.
this interview, and then how they see them now that their partner is showing their true colors. So that's just one factor. There's a bunch of other
Yeah.
traits. I'll pause there though and ask if there's anything you wanted to expand on further about that.
That is fascinating because I have never heard that, and
Mm.
that is just so helpful, for me, myself, but I know for many of our listeners, because you do wonder, and I've talked with other, individuals on the podcast, and that hasn't come up necessarily at all, that type of research and the super traits. Now, um, with the cognitive dissonance, obviously you just have this conflict, right, in your brain, and that what does that lead to, as far as, behaviors, I guess, or symptoms for these women? Since, I'm talking mostly about women as the recipient of this, or as the
Yeah, and
victim.
that is true that often that's the case. Um, Cognitive dissonance, okay, so there's like a bunch of different factors that go into this. When you start a relationship, a pathological love relationship, there is a love bombing phase. There's this kind of
Mhm.
like fantasy of, oh, we're such a good match. This is the perfect person. The person is often presenting themselves in a way that they know aligns with your values and your needs so that it seems like this fantasy perfect fit. So that's how you view the relationship as the victim of this type of relationship. And then they start to devalue you and eventually maybe even discard you. And they start
Mhm.
to, their mask starts to slip and they start to show you things about themselves that you really can't reconcile with the
Right.
version of them that they first showed you and now the version that you're seeing now. That's cognitive dissonance. It's like black or white, all or nothing. He's good or he's
Yeah.
bad.
Mhm.
I'm confident or I'm a mess. I'm making sense or I'm crazy. Like it's all or nothing. And a lot of times women flip back and forth between those two states and it deteriorates your mental functioning. Like it's a huge issue and it takes a really long time to recover from. People who have been smart, successful, established in their careers can really fall apart from being in this cognitive dissonance stage for too long.
Wow. Wow, that's yeah, that is, it is fascinating, but in hearing you say that, though, it makes sense in
I'm
all
sure
that
you
I've
see
done
that.
to understand, and what we see with that. So, what are some of the other super traits?
So cooperative. Women who
Okay.
get into these relationships are often, they have a giving nature, they derive
Mhm.
pleasure from helping others, they're willing to compromise, they're considerate, they're trusting. So
Mhm.
they have a pretty optimistic view about human behavior. They don't necessarily vet as strongly as they should because they have this optimistic view about human behavior.
Mm.
And all this, by the way, falls under the trait of agreeableness. Agreeableness is
Okay.
a trait that's on this personality test called the Big Five personality test. And people who fall victim to these types of relationships are often very high on agreeableness.
Okay.
Um, and it's a great trait. Like you're, as you hear me describing these things, you're going to think like, this sounds like a great person. And it is. You're a great
Right,
partner
right.
in so many ways, which is why you can put up with the level of ridiculousness that you're going to experience in this
Mhm.
relationship. So the trusting we talked about, These people are usually very humble, so they downplay their own accomplishments, which makes them an easy target.
Okay.
They're gentle and they're well-tempered, they're warm and approachable, and this is often what a psychopath or a narcissist will look for in a target. So they're very intentional in vetting their targets when it comes to this level of pathology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're empathetic,
Wow.
meaning
Mm-hmm.
you can see other people's perspective really well. You're a peacemaker, you're forgiving, you're generous. You have a high level of tolerance. I said that earlier, and
Yeah.
meaning you just can endure a lot. You can accept a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different viewpoints. You're skillful at dealing with others who are different from you. And this is also contrary to what we often think. You're straightforward. So you're like kind of like a tell it like it is person. You're upfront, you're honest, you confide in others, you tend to be a little bit chatty, which means you might over disclose, making yourself an easy victim as well.
Mm-hmm.
You're loyal, so you're committed to what you sign up for and you don't give up easily. And you're
Mm-hmm.
conscientious. And there's a whole slew of qualities that go into conscientiousness as well, which is another trait on the big five personality factor. But again, I'll pause there and see if there's anything you want to talk about with those.
Yeah, this is so fascinating just because it's like, you're right. It sounds like great people.
Right?
You
Like
know,
I want to date that person.
right, right. And, also what is surprising is that this, particularly the self-directed, confident, somebody so direct, you don't think this would be someone who would maybe be susceptible to those cluster B personalities. So it's really fascinating.
And the direct component, these all interplay together, right? So, like, you're
Hmm.
direct, but you also have an optimistic view of humankind. So, you assume most people are direct and most people are saying what they
Yeah.
mean, and most people are honest and straightforward. So, you kind of
Hmm.
assume, like, oh, most people are like me, but they're
Right.
not,
They're
especially not
not.
these folks.
Right. So yeah, just seeing the best in people and, oh, right. Yeah, of course they're capable of this,
Hmm.
or believing them for being who they say they are. Right?
Hmm.
Because you're direct, you're someone who is going to be straightforward, so you just presume that they are as well. And that's part of how they get you, I suppose.
Yeah. And then the last is conscientiousness. And this means you are someone who's led by your values and morals. You're a hard worker, you're goal oriented. Now, remember, you're loyal as well. We talked about loyalty. So, like,
Mhm.
again, think of all these things in pairing. If you
Right.
are goal oriented and hardworking and you're led by your values and you're loyal, again, you're going to stick with it. You're going to stick with it longer
Yes.
than most people would. People who
Mhm.
are conscientious are very easy to guilt trip because
Oh.
they're more likely than others to take responsibility for the outcome of their own behavior. So they're the first ones to be like, you know what, you're right. That was my fault. I shouldn't have done XYZ. I'll take responsibility for that, which is, again, it's a great quality in a healthy
Mhm.
relationship. And it makes you
Right.
easily manipulated in an unhealthy relationship.
This is fascinating stuff. And I think you're absolutely right. Many of our listeners are going to feel seen and heard and like, oh my gosh, nobody's ever explained it to me like that.
Yeah.
Um, but it fits together with everything you're talking about, which is just, whew, it kind of is
Yeah.
just a little bit, it's a lot for these women, I'm sure. Now, what are some of the trauma symptoms you might see from your perspective as a psychologist, with these, survivors, victims?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times I see them in a number of ways because they can come to me in a PLR still, or
Hmm.
they can come to me individually considering should I stay or should I go, or they can come to me post breakup and wanting to
Okay.
heal from the breakup. So I kind of see them in
Mm.
all different stages, and the trauma symptoms look a little bit different in different stages. But I would say from start to finish, a common thread is that they are confused. There's that cognitive
Mm,
dissonance again. Like, I don't even know what is happening anymore. I don't know what's right, what's wrong, what's real, what's not. I'm confused. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't recognize how I'm showing up. I don't recognize my partner in some of these moments. Like, I'm
mhm.
just confused.
That is it.
Um,
Wow, that's interesting.
yeah.
Um, how do these women, or why do they? I guess the better question is why? Why do women get stuck in the pathological love relationship?
I think women in particular in our society are taught to be caregivers. We're taught to be forgiving. We're taught to be
Mhm,
nurturing. Um, we also are, uh, there's a lot of misogyny out there, and it's just kind of like internalized within a lot of women as well as men. And misogyny is a general hatred for women, right? So it's just like
mm,
we get paid less, we have fewer resources in some instances. So we're easier to control and to keep, quote unquote, captive. And then there's this general belief that women should put up with that certain level of misogyny or abuse or um, just disrespect that would
mhm,
almost never be tolerated by men, and is just so normal in our society.
mhm,
And then we often aren't believed when we're victims of abuse and are thought to be hysterical or histrionic ourselves and
mhm,
exaggerating and overly emotional. And so women will often discount their own experience, their own internal experience, and even talk themselves into believing that they're being too dramatic because that's just the cultural
mhm,
narrative. And then obviously, like, if you're in a relationship with someone who's trying to control you and manipulate you, it's a very insidious process. And it starts slow. It starts as that fantasy that I talked about. And then you're like a lobster in water that doesn't know it's boiling, or like the frog in the
the frog,
kettle, as they
right?
talk
Yeah.
about. Yeah. Yeah. And
Mhm.
before you know it, you're boiling and you didn't even realize you were in water that was gradually warming.
The And as part of that, just, when women are in these relationships, do you have them come to you and think that maybe they're the narcissist in the
Mhm,
relationship?
all the time. I I would say most people in relationships like this ask me if they're the narcissist at some point. And
Okay.
uh, again, that's the confusion. Like, am I really a good person, or am I
Hmm.
doing all these twisted things that my partner says I'm doing? And then
Hmm.
one of the big coping strategies that cluster B or like narcissistic people use is projection. And what that means is taking parts of myself that I don't like and attributing those traits to you instead.
Hmm.
So you'll very often hear narcissistic partners telling their codependent counterparts that they are a narcissist. And because these women are so willing to go work on themselves and they're so conscientious, they're like, well, I better go fix myself.
I better.
Let me get in therapy.
Right,
I'm a
right. He tells
narcissist.
me I'm a narcissist. Yeah, I've got to go fix
Yeah.
this.
Which is so great. If that gets her in therapy, awesome, because that's where the work starts.
Right, absolutely. Now, explain to me, if you could, the difference in the pathological love relationships versus codependent relationship, or some other type of abusive relationship, or are they very similar? Are they the
Yeah.
same?
Yeah. There's a lot of crossover. I think they're all very similar in terms of the effects that it has on people and the dynamics that you see. Um, One difference is what I talked about earlier, that self directedness and that self confidence. Um, Women who are defined as kind of codependent are usually a little bit more helpless, a little bit
Okay.
more um, less confident and kind of more submissive in some ways.
Mhm.
Whereas a lot of people that we see in these PLRs they have that self-directed quality. So I've also heard this called being an active codependent. So there's like a passive codependent and an active codependent. This was defined in a book called The Human Magnet Syndrome. And really what an active codependent is someone that I'm just the super traits that I'm describing. So it's,
Mm.
someone who says what's on their mind, who doesn't shy away from a fight, who is maybe even quite assertive or aggressive and stands up for themselves, but they still stay in the dynamic rather than walking away.
Okay. Now, what about, because we're going to talk about the coercive control and
Hmm.
pathological love relationships. So help me unpack that, because there's a lot there as well.
Yeah. I mean, the intent of coercive control is to subjugate the victim and
Mhm.
have complete control as the abuser. And it's a really insidious process. Again, like pathological love relationships, there's a spectrum. So not everyone is going to be this conscious and intentional in doing this, but
Mhm.
somebody who's described or could be considered a psychopath or someone with antisocial personality disorder and like very malignant narcissist, this is the level of dysfunction you're looking at. So
Okay.
they're lying, they're gaslighting, they're isolating you from your social support networks. They might be monitoring you by looking at your phone or using spyware to see what you're doing, GPS trackers. Um, Sometimes they're depriving you of your basic needs, not giving you money so that you can buy
Mhm.
food or clothes even for the
Right.
kids sometimes. Um, they really try to take control of every aspect of your everyday life. And they also emotionally do a lot to control you. So they'll put you down. They'll tell you no one's going to love you. How could anyone love someone like you? They might humiliate you or degrade you. Physical assault is not uncommon, as well as threats of physical assault. They might slander you in the community and certainly control your finances. So there's a lot of things that can happen when you're in the relationship that would be coercive control. And then in divorce, because I know a lot of your listeners are going through divorce, there's a whole other slew of behaviors that can be coercive control.
Wow, which I want to talk about that as well,
Hmm.
because um yes, we have so many clients, so many women, who are seeking a divorce and realize that, and it may not be to the pathological extreme, but it's pretty bad still for them. And I know they would say that. And
Hmm.
they that was their experience for sure, especially with the control. And that's a big part of the relationships, certainly, that we see. And I'd love to talk a little bit about that in the divorce process, what you see, and that might help some of our listeners recognizing that in, with the coercive control.
Yeah. Oh, this is so tough because as I know, you probably see this all the time where the battles are so drawn out.
Yes.
The person with the cluster B personality disorder is exerting control by not, having their lawyers not answer or not giving documents that their lawyers
Hmm.
need to move the process forward. They will draw out custody battles, financial battles, whatever, for as long as possible. Really, they're deriving fuel and validation from that process, and ending it ends their fuel source. So
Hmm.
they keep it going, even though it's, probably costing them, ridiculous amounts of money as well. They will. And because a lot of these folks lack empathy, they drag the kids into it and
Hmm.
they'll do things to get your attention, things that you can't ignore, like neglecting or abusing the children, or not keeping the kids safe or not doing like basic care for the kids.
Mhm.
Um, that's a way to control you. And it's terrifying because what are you going
Right.
to do? I mean, you can't ignore it.
Right.
Um, and your kids will suffer if you let it go. But ultimately, like you've got to find a balance between what battles you fight and what you don't, or you will always be under their control. Um,
Exactly. And those are so difficult because
mhm.
the courts, I think, just generally have fundamentally no understanding of this.
Yeah,
Their, training in mental health and specifically in this is limited if any. And, just those few examples you said about with the kids, and right, that they're not being cared for and they're doing these things to get to you, but then getting in front of a judge and then proving that is it's difficult and it's a battle, which again, then I'm sure feeds their fuel because then they're like, oh, yay, now we've got another forum with
mhm.
which, I can exert control, make her life miserable, cause her to spend a lot of money and sometimes really make her perceived as not very believable. It can be extremely difficult because the judges don't understand and they would say, "Oh, you're just being petty. Mom, you're the one trying to control his every move."
Right,
With the kid, they totally turn it around and then he gets more, emboldened and, empowered because he's like, "Oh, the judge is on my side. They see this." It's very difficult and, for women with children with these types of men, and a lot of times, and it sounds terrible, but it's like, all right, you've got to look at the period of time which when they're under 18, you're just, kind of are mandated to be drawn in, and
yeah,
communicate with them and try to do this together. It's really, I just don't see where there's ever any positive that comes out of it. I
I
mean, I guess, well, you
know.
do have your children, but you really are going to suffer for quite some time out of this.
Yeah. Yeah, and the court this is that internalized misogyny again that I was talking about earlier,
Yes.
pegging the woman as controlling or
Mhm.
overly emotional or irrational. Um, it's so easy for men to work the system like that because of this
Mhm.
internalized misogyny that we all have been fed.
Yep, exactly, and it
Yeah,
doesn't matter if the judge is a woman or not that we have very many
it doesn't.
female
No.
judges, but
Yeah.
they're almost worse, like, they just really
Mhm.
don't see it. Um, which I guess, worried about, "Oh, I'll be seen weak or something if, I were to, see that for what it is."
Yeah.
Now let's talk about, because you mentioned the love bombing, and I want to talk a little bit about the narcissist cycle of abuse for our listeners, because I think that's really important. Not that we've certainly talked about it on this show a lot, but I think it's really important to continue, like,
Mhm.
talk about that cycle of abuse so that they understand.
Yeah, and it definitely relates to what we were just talking about with coercive control because love bombing is the first step of coercive control. Like it's
Mm.
calculated.
Mm.
um, from even how they choose their targets. So,
Wow.
they recognize that increased level of empathy and that increased level of conscientiousness and agreeableness. And they're vetting you often to see, can I get away with this? Can I do this? And she'll understand. Like, how much can I?
Mhm.
Well, I guess that's getting into the D value. Let me back up the vetting
Okay.
first with the love bombing.
Right.
So, love bombing is they are looking for vulnerable targets. Um, they sometimes even look at your social media ahead of time. I had a client who talked about her ex was profiling her social media and could tell she had just broken up with someone because
Mm.
of the inspiring posts and like the posts about self-confidence, etc., that she was posting. She was oversharing, right, like as some of these
Oversharing.
folks
Uh-huh.
tend to do. And it was very obvious that she was going through a transformation and very obvious that she was vulnerable. He told her this, but he framed it as she was single. It was very obvious she was becoming single and that he wanted to swoop in and get her before someone else did. But really,
Mm,
like when you translate that, it's I saw vulnerability. I saw someone who is susceptible and I swooped in and created a fantasy of everything that was missing. So they make big declarations during the love bombing stage. I love you comes very early. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I can see having kids with you. You know, it depends what you are looking for. That's kind of what the compliments and big
mhm,
declarations will entail. Might be really good sex because the emotional intimacy is kind of shallow and it's not really vulnerable.
okay.
So sex is often the period of time where you're most vulnerable with someone, and that makes the sex
Mhm.
really good. Um,
Got it.
he makes these big declarations and he reveals vulnerabilities. Often they're false vulnerabilities and gets you to be more vulnerable. Then again, figuring out like what makes her tick, what makes her, what does she want? What does she need? And let me give that exact thing to her. Let me fill that
Mm,
exact void with all of
mm,
my declarations and like create a whole personality around this. Yeah, so it's just like you feel like
wow.
you've met someone who you've been looking for your entire life and they just fit right in and have the same values as you, the same interests, the same beliefs. And you often might hear about his past as like everyone he's dated has been crazy and he's a victim of his circumstances and he's been
Mhm.
screwed over so many times by so many different people. Huge red flag.
Right,
um, but yeah, there's like just this exciting love, you know, lovey-dovey phase of I can't
right.
believe this person is real. And they're not.
And they're
That's
not.
the
That's
thing.
why
Yeah.
if you doubt it. And it's one where probably, especially I'm sure once they're in therapy, but I would imagine you were like, yeah, or my friends were just like, this seems an awful lot really soon. And but
Yes.
they don't want to believe in it. They're like, oh, you just don't understand. Like, but people on the
Yeah.
outside looking in think this seems to be a really, really fast, really soon with this person
Yeah.
that you hardly know.
I mean, if you think about it, you can't possibly decide you want to spend the rest of your life with someone after knowing them for 3 months. You have seen
Yeah.
them in like 10 out of 10 million different types of situations that you will
Hmm.
encounter in your entire life. Like, you can't
Yeah.
make an informed choice at that point, and it's really crazy to be saying that you can. It's a
Mhm.
projection. It's a projection of
It's a
who you think they
projection.
are and who you hope they are.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, you're being optimistic and believing them because you don't realize that they are not being truthful and
Yeah.
they're deceiving you. So
Yep.
then comes the devaluing.
Yep. So this is where the mask starts to slip.
Okay.
Um, they may have started isolating you a little bit during the love bombing stage just by
Mhm.
you being so excited you want to spend all your time with them, and them being so
Right.
excited they want to ask you to hang out all the time. But now it really starts to happen where they're covertly kind of manipulating you away from your support system. They
Mm.
might start talking crap about your friends. They might start devaluing you, like saying you're doing things wrong, or you have these negative qualities, or you've changed and you're not how you used to be. You're not as
Mhm.
loving as you used to be. You're not as kind as you used to be, which also happens over time, right? Like as you get out of the romantic love stage, it's normal to not be as obsessed with your partner as you are during your romantic love stage, but they will use
Right.
that against you, and kind of talk about things you're doing wrong. And so you'll start to notice, and you'll also start to notice incongruencies in their behavior. So,
Mm.
the big declarations they made in the beginning, maybe they start pulling back from those a little bit,
Mhm.
or you can just tell they're not as committed as they were. Like it's a felt sense that something's different.
Mhm. And so within that cycle, then is I guess, and I don't know, do they typically go in order? Because then I have like discarding next, or do they
No,
sometimes, no?
Not necessarily. Sometimes you'll go straight from love bombing to discard because they found a better
Oh.
source, or they vetted you and
Ah.
realized you aren't as susceptible as they thought.
Mm. Okay.
So
Got it.
it's and also sometimes devaluing starts because they're love bombing somebody else. And you don't find out about this until much later, of course, or if never.
Oh, right.
But they find a more attractive source of validation for themselves. And
Mhm.
so they kind of start devaluing you, pushing you out, treating you poorly, and they're like giving all their love and attention to this other person. So no, they could be doing this with multiple people at the same time in multiple different stages. And so you could go from love bomb to discard like within 3 weeks and just be like, what happened?
Right.
Yeah, but if
That's
devaluing is drawn out, which it often can be, then
uh-huh.
there might be you get more and more entwined. There's more and more opportunities for manipulation and abuse, like maybe financial abuse if you start
Mhm.
combining finances. They might start controlling who you can hang out with and stalking you, looking at your phone, stuff like that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Mhm.
so, all these could happen really quickly and it could be over and done with before you even realize what happened to you, or these could be drawn out over decades and they happen over and over
Wow.
again in a relationship.
Right, because it's a cycle. It just
Yeah,
keeps you just keep going through it. It's exhausting,
right.
I would imagine.
Yeah. So the discard, sometimes it means breaking up and
Mhm.
they leave suddenly. You don't even know what happened, or they get you to break up with them sometimes if they're, particularly manipulative. Um, it could also just be giving you the silent treatment for a few days to a week.
Mm.
Um, it could be leaving you and going and sleeping with someone else for a week and then coming back and being like, I was wrong. I can't believe I thought I loved them, but they're nothing compared to you. It can look really different um, depending on the relationship. And then the last is hoovering. So after they discard you, very often they will try to lure you back in, or like Hoover vacuum, suck you back in.
Mhm. Suck you
Um,
back in.
this might be like a happy birthday text after a year, or
Mhm.
it might be a week later they discard you, and then a week later they're like, I don't know what I was thinking. I can't live without you. Please take me back. Um, it could be a natural disaster happens in your area and you haven't even talked to them for years. And they
Wow.
quote unquote innocently reach out to see how you're doing after the fires in your area. I mean, it can be literally years later and they're just
Wow.
feeling to see, do I still have any control here?
Mm. This is like, yeah, this is very interesting. I didn't know
Yeah.
that on the timeline because it just
Mhm.
varies and they're so good at it. So this could be weeks, months, years.
Yeah.
And I mean some
Decades. Like some
decades.
people
Yeah,
have
I was
been
to
in
say
this
it's
dynamic
for
for 30
decades.
years. Yeah.
That would
And
just to be
that's the cognitive dissonance piece. It's like this is crazy making, right? So
yeah.
you go back to love bombing and a honeymoon stage every time. And it may get
Mm.
less intense, but there's still
Uh-huh.
this like period of atonement and period of intense love and connection. And people get confused and think that's the real relationship. But the real relationship is the whole cycle over and over again.
Right. Now, why is being involved in this cycle so addictive, you think, or just so difficult to break out? I don't know if addictive is the right word.
No, it is. It is.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. The exact same reward centers are at play in your brain as addiction. So
Yeah.
that love bombing, getting back to that connection and to that like fantasy,
Mhm.
releases dopamine, and that's the neurotransmitter in your brain associated with reward and addiction and continually seeking. And then when
Mhm.
you are out of it, I've seen people literally going through withdrawals, like in a corner,
Wow.
crying, shaking, feeling like they are going to die without their person. And it's so similar to the kind of withdrawals you see portrayed from heroin addicts in movies trying to get clean.
Wow.
Yeah.
How how do you leave a marriage when you've been in that, and so much control and
Mhm.
just abuse, you know, and how you can even think straight? I don't even know. I mean, how do women do that? How are they able to get strong enough to do that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a delicate process, and it can be a dangerous process as well, especially if you're in like a physically abusive relationship. Um,
Right.
Often when you try to leave is the most dangerous time, and the time that you'll get hurt the worst, or God
Mm.
forbid, even killed. So it's definitely something where I would seek professional help. If you
Yeah.
recognize that you're in a relationship like this, start getting trauma informed therapy and building up your confidence and starting to reduce that cognitive dissonance so you can see the relationship for what it is. And this will help you hold your boundaries if and when you do leave, or even hold your boundaries inside the relationship. Like maybe it's not a full blown PLR. And
Mhm.
once you get in touch with some of that confidence and some of those boundaries, your partner can modify their behavior and is motivated to get in therapy and change. Like that's not out of the question if it's not a completely pathological relationship either. So it starts with
Mhm.
getting the help yourself and building your own kind of confidence in your judgment and self-trust, rebuilding it for many people.
Rebuilding it, right. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
so you said trauma-informed therapy. So I think that's really important
Mhm.
that our listeners who may recognize some of this and think, "Okay, what does that mean? How do they find that?"
Yeah. Um, there's a bunch of different types of therapy out there, and it also kind of depends what's going on in your life in the moment, because you may not be a candidate for some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. If your life is in total chaos,
Mhm,
most therapists aren't going to start EMDR therapy with you, which is one of the trauma informed modalities.
mhm.
But trauma informed means somebody has training specifically in healing trauma. And with a situation like this, you want to look specifically for somebody who has attachment trauma focus. So modalities would be things like attachment focused EMDR, um, somatic experiencing, or somatic reprocessing, therapies that involve a body based approach as well as a cognitive approach, because you can't outthink, like, you can't think your way out of this, and you can't, changing the way you think isn't enough. So,
Okay.
but again, if you're in the midst of like an abusive relationship, you're not going to start doing like deep trauma processing. Your therapist is going to work with stabilizing you, helping
Right.
you figure out how to stay safe, and then doing some of this deeper work. But you'd rather get set up with someone who can do that deeper work with you from the beginning,
Mhm.
and not have to switch therapists once you're ready to do it.
Now, you talked about in the very beginning of the show, attachment trauma, and I don't know if it was I'm thinking in my head attachment like disorder, but I don't know that that was what you said, but I remember the word attachment and that there was so much more
Mhm.
to that
Mhm.
with you know, with individuals who women who get, you know, into these kind of relationships or the victims. Could you explain that a little bit more to me because I found that interesting.
Yeah. So we often we have unhealthy love templates because of how we were raised as kids.
Okay.
And that's essentially what I mean by attachment trauma, is that there was either something lacking in the attachment that you had to your caregivers, like they didn't pay enough attention to your emotions, or they didn't provide you with enough support or attention. They were kind of neglectful
Hmm.
emotionally. Um, and you may have had all your physical needs met, by the way. Like a lot of people who grew up in affluent communities have attachment trauma because their
Okay.
parents were so work focused and achievement focused, they completely neglected the emotional side of things.
Okay.
Um, Other forms of attachment trauma are experiencing bullying, racism, misogyny, um, being emotionally abused, or witnessing emotional abuse between parents.
Mm.
Certainly witnessing physical abuse between parents or being physically abused. Those are big attachment traumas. But they're like these little repeated behaviors, either things that were bad that weren't supposed to happen or things that were good that didn't happen. And they
Oh,
happen over and over again to the point where your view of like what's love and what are relationships is not a healthy template. And so you got to
okay.
heal that so that you're not attracted to stuff like this.
Right. Because, right, we're talking and we're thinking, okay, for any of our listeners and any of our clients that have been in this, like, we want you to get into that trauma informed therapy and heal so that you don't um, fall prey to
Repeat
this
this.
again, because that's terrible. But I have a
Exactly.
feeling it happens. It has happened, I'm sure,
It does
often.
happen a lot.
And you don't see it again the
Yeah.
next time, right? Even until later. And then you're like, oh, yeah, now.
Yeah. That's why, and you can understand all of this cognitively, but if you don't change your felt sense of what a relationship feels like and what
Mm.
like home, quote unquote, home feels like, if home wasn't
Mhm.
a healthy place to be, you don't want to meet someone and say, oh, they feel like home. I feel like I know them for 1,000 years. It's like, yikes.
Right.
If, if home wasn't healthy, that's a red flag. So you got to kind
Yeah.
of heal that felt sense of like what is
Mhm.
connection.
And so
And
that's why
that's
you were
done
saying
through
more
that
than just the
somatic
head,
work.
right? Through the
Exactly.
body work, right? So you have to
Hmm.
really work through that, which I would imagine is I don't want to but it's difficult, right? A lot of things worth doing are like you're going to really have to confront a lot of things, I think, probably about
Yep.
yourself and your experiences in order to heal that.
Yeah. We can only really attract in the type of relationship that we're capable of having with ourselves and with others. So if you aren't looking at yourself and really knowing the deepest parts of yourself, you're going to attract in someone who's not really looking at themselves and maybe projecting a lot of themselves onto you or onto others. So, you got to become what you want to attract.
Ooh, that's some tough work. You're right. I agree with you, right? And maybe not what
Hmm.
everyone wants to hear, right? Because it's like, well, you're only able to attract what you're able to have. So that's
Hmm.
fascinating. Now, what would you say to a woman or maybe a listener who's currently experiencing this on some level?
Mm, you're not crazy.
Ugh,
It
that's
is
good. That's a good one.
confusing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you're confused by design. And if you've been isolated, reconnect with others, tell them what's
Mhm.
happening so that you can get some grounding. A lot of times, I think women are embarrassed to tell their friends and family about what's happening because they don't want their community to think negatively of their partner or of them, right? They might judge them for
Right.
staying in a relationship where so much bad stuff is happening. But I found over and over again, that's kind of the first step to people realizing they're not crazy is
Mm.
talking to other people and getting feedback like, whoa, wait, what happened? He did what?
Yeah.
He said what? And you get this feedback where you're like, oh, I was supposed to be enraged by that.
Yes. Yeah,
you
that's not
know?
normal. That's not normal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I
So talk to people.
that's great advice because part of this is you do become so isolated and then the shame, the embarrassment, all of those things that he's really counting on, right? Because he's probably going to tell you that no one's going to believe you. They're going to think you're
Mhm.
crazy. Everybody thinks you're so lucky to be with me. And you've gotten in a pattern of believing that, or you're not real sure, but you do doubt your own instincts at this
Mhm.
point, probably.
Yeah, and you sugarcoat it as well. You might tell a
Yeah.
very edited version of how things went
Mm.
down and you protect
Mhm.
him. Yeah,
Gosh, why? Is that goes
there's
back
so
to
many.
the personality, the super traits, but wow, that's so our brains, the psychology of this is just so deep in so many levels.
Yeah. It also that goes back to the attachment trauma piece because if your parents were neglecting you or treating you in an abusive way, as a kid, you almost have to pretend that's not happening to stay attached to them and to stay in love with them so that you don't
Mhm.
wanna leave home. And as a kid, if you leave home, you're gonna die, right? You can't take
Right.
care of yourself, you can't make money, you can't find
Mhm.
food, like, it is a life or death situation. And that almost gets recreated in a relationship like this where you forget you're a competent adult who can leave and you
Uh-huh.
don't have to deny all this stuff or die.
Wow. That's good. That's good. Yeah, I like that. Remembering that because I think they do. You're right. That explains in so many ways why women are, are so scared and think it's so difficult, but they've forgotten,
Mhm.
right? They're kind of reliving some of that from their past. Wow. I can't even believe we're out of time. I can't believe that.
I know.
Because this is so and it's just so important. I appreciate you so much because these are things that, we need to talk about and it's so helpful to learn more. But Sarah, before we go, could you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career?
Yeah, I think we are so resilient, and I think that we are capable of massive amounts of change and flexibility and adaptation. Um, and there wouldn't be a world without women. So
Yes, that's right.
do
That's
not
right.
undervalue yourself. We are amazing and capable of so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Also, though, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
Yeah, our website is coupleslearn.com. And we do work with individuals as well as couples. So I know the name is very couples geared, but me and my team are definitely trained in this kind of work. And everywhere else on the socials is also couples learn. We're most active on Instagram, but you can find us on all the socials.
Well, thank you so much. And we have reached the end of our show today. And again, thank you to Dr. Sarah Schewitz for joining us today to discuss pathological love relationships, coercive control, and how to heal and recognize and to know at least you're not alone. You heard what you heard here today. If you recognize that, we will have the links in our show notes in order for you to get those resources you need and the help you need. Again, Sarah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at floridawomensLawGroup.com. You'll find the link in the episode description. And thank you for listening.